Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us on Talksport. We've had a big week for the banking industry, lots of reports and figures and profits and losses and all the rest of it. It seems from, I should say, the layman's point of view, that the banks that the taxpayers seem to have bailed out are in much worse shape than the banks that we didn't bail out.
No, it's not as simple as that. There's no major differentiation between government-owned and non-government-owned. The headlines might indeed, as you imply, suggest that. It's simply to do with the various banks' activities. At the beginning of the week, as you say, we had Barclays and HSBC, which are not government-owned, and they made vast profits for the last 6 months. And then we heard about Lloyds, Halifax, Bank of Scotland, which made a vast loss, and that is government-owned. Northern Rock recently, a couple of days ago, made a big loss, and RBS made a tiny profit or a substantial loss, depending upon who your accountant is. And the latter banks are indeed effectively government-owned. But the profits of Barclays and HSBC actually came from their huge trading operations, where they're buying and selling stocks and shares themselves, as opposed to normal bank lending functions, which actually is largely what Lloyds, Halifax, Bank of Scotland, RBS and Northern Rock have been up to. So the big money has come from trading in the last 6 months.
Sure, and certainly RBS, I think their investment arm, as they call it, made $5 billion in the first 6 months.
And the rest of the side, the normal stuff lending to homes and businesses, I believe lost $4 billion, so hence they had a net $1 billion loss, or it's also being reported as a £15 million profit. Either way, it's hardly a profit or a loss for a company of that huge size.
And also, I would guess that the banks that we did have to bail out were in much worse shape than HSBC and Barclays.
Well,
so that
absolutely. I heard a very interesting anecdote today, just today, funnily enough. The Halifax bank, which of course had demutualised many years ago, apparently had loaned the most buy-to-let loans in the country, but not one of them was shown as a buy-to-let mortgage. In other words, they were all basically dodgy mortgages, but the Halifax just wanted to hit lending targets for those years, so they just lent, didn't really care what kind of lending it was.
Similarly, the Northern Rock figures showed that they had a lot more mortgages in arrears for more than 3 months than most of the other banks, because I suppose of the nature of the people they lend to.
22,000 mortgages from just the Northern Rock alone in arrears of in excess of 3 months, and that's 4% of all of their mortgages. There's no doubt that very soon we're going to see, and it's not just Northern Rock, but Lloyds as well, have got humongous numbers of mortgages in arrears, a multiple, in fact, of Northern Rock. There's no doubt, therefore, that very soon, whether it's weeks or to the end of this year, going into next year, I'm afraid to say, we're going to see tens of thousands of properties repossessed. There's no doubt about that in my mind. The repossessions were simply deferred over the last 12 months by government initiatives, but they're coming home to roost now. No question.
And so, I mean, would you say, for example, therefore, that the property market, if that does happen, which will then continue to go down in value, the banks will be left with a bunch of properties that they can't really sell off to cover the amounts of money that they've loaned out? Is this a case of the government and the taxpayer, I suppose, throwing good money after bad by continuing to just prop these organisations up?
Look, it's all political. The government stimulus, quote unquote, to bail out the banks in order, in theory, to get lending going. I mean, talk about throwing money down people's throats who are already up to their neck in debt. That is effectively what government policy is. The government stimulus has all been about how many fewer seats can we lose at the next election. That's all what it's about. There is no way that the quantitative easing, as it's been called, the bank bailouts as well, there's no doubt it has not worked. We still see enormous numbers of people being made insolvent. Just today, 30-odd thousand people in the first quarter of the year bankrupt or insolvent. Goodness knows how many companies are going under. It's all political. Throwing good money after bad? Well, you tell me. At the moment, the man and woman on the street don't actually have the pain of all those bank bailouts and quantitative easing, but because everything is deferred until the next election in May of next year. I tell you, after that election, depending on who gets in, either it's going to be massive tax rises, and I'm not talking hyperbole, I've done the numbers, it's going to be massive tax rises for the next 10 years, and or it's going to be massive cuts in public spending. Either way, that is when the man and woman on the street it's really going to hit home to them how much of a mess our economy is in.
Sure. And of course the Bank of England says this extra 50 billion that they've basically just pumped into the economy with this quantitative easing nonsense. They reckon that that's in order to try and free up the lending process, which is what the banks have already been ordered to do, but yet don't seem to be doing. You know, small businesses are being starved of loans and overdrafts,
yep.
as are individuals. So where's all this money going?
Yeah, all of the initiatives have had the headlines, we're going to get the economy going. Well, you know, it's never been about that in reality, in my view. It's always been about the government bailing out their friends in high places, which is the bankers, ultimately. Where is the money going? Well, quite simply, the money's going into the bank's reserves, and look at the bonuses. They haven't stopped being in the multi-million pound bracket. The bankers are killing themselves laughing. And as I say, our taxes are going to go through the roof after the next election. The money going into the system, in theory, or at least in the headline from the politicians, is we'll give it to the banks and the banks will give it to the people and to the businesses of Britain. Absolute arrant nonsense. The banks have got hidden in their books humongous bad debts. Look at residential property. It's already down about 20% from the high in September 2007. And of course, there's been a rise in the last few months. But if you look at unemployment, if you look at mortgage rates which are rising, if you look at the level of government debt, and if you consider the tax rises and public sector spending cuts of next year, there's no doubt in my mind that house prices are going to fall for the next couple of years, and those are going to show up as massive repossessions and massive bad debts.
But then, I suppose there's a couple of things.
Hold on. Then you move on to commercial property. You might have seen recently, 10% of all shops in the United Kingdom are lying empty. Then you look at the offices in the city and around the country. Then you look at warehouses. There is massive bad debts in banks' balance sheets. And the banks are going to be going back to the government for years saying, if you don't give us money, then this economy is going to go down the tube. Do you know what? They're giving them money, the economy's still going down the tube.
Yeah, so at what point does the government say, well, excuse me, I'm sorry, you can be like somebody who's got an overdraft and we're going to call it in now because you're obviously not behaving responsibly. Why don't they just stop giving them money?
Votes. It's all about the next election. I guess after the next election, depending on who's in, they're going to be in for the next 5 years, and potentially, if there's a change of government, please no, I'm not blue or red. I'm not Labour or Tory. I'm just putting the wider picture in my view based on how I see it. If the Tories get in next year, and the polls are certainly suggesting that, the likelihood is they're going to be in for the next 10 years. Then it's entirely possible they may say, we're not going to give you money to the extent that you've had it. But you know what? It might not even be the government's opportunity to do so. Because where's the government, where's the Bank of England getting all this money from? And let's put in perspective how much we're talking about. You talked about £50 billion, which the Bank of England announced this week. That's to add to the £125 billion that they put in early in the year. And on top of that, the government in total has assumed liabilities from the banks of £1,200 billion. Where is that money coming from? It's coming from global money markets who are lending it to the UK government. At some point, those global markets are going to say, hey, we're not going to lend you this money because we're not sure we're going to get it back. The government will say, you'll get it back, we'll pay you more for it. In other words, our long-term interest rates are going to rise over the next few years. That's going to create inflation. That's going to bring up Bank of England interest rates. That means that over the next 5 or 10 years, I'm deadly serious, you're not going to see rising house prices for years. House prices, in fact, are going to fall for the next couple of years, big time, just like they did last year.
Well, you made me feel quite depressed now, Jonathan. I may have to emigrate. I was watching Barack Obama.
I don't know where you'd go, because
I was watching Barack
it's not just
Obama.
The UK government, every country's in the knacker's yard. Global finance is in a dreadful state.
Well, I was going to ask you that as a final question. You know, is Britain any worse off than anywhere else? Because Obama's come out, because only on Friday did they publish the latest unemployment figures in the States, and for the first time it looks as though they're not as bad as they were expected to be. They're still up, but they're not up by as much. So are we worse off than anywhere else?
Okay, 2 points. First of all, the stock market's up the last few months. That's globally. House prices are up the last few months. That's also globally. And we hear all the time about green shoots. Absolute aren't nonsense. They're not taking into account 100,000 a month unemployed extra, going from 1.7 million unemployed last year to about 3.25 to 3.5 million unemployed next year. And then, as I say, government debt. Is the UK in a worse state than other places? I'm afraid to say it absolutely is. Every country is knackered. Practically every country is knackered. We are in a particularly bad state because we had just about the biggest housing bubble and credit bubble in the G10, the 10 biggest economies. In Western Europe, we are in the worst situation apart from minor economies, the Republic of Ireland and Spain, who are even worse than us, and that's saying something.
Goodness me. Jonathan, well, let's hope you're not completely correct about all of that, but thank you very much indeed for your thoughts.
Well, call me back in a year's time and let's see what's happened.
If I can afford the phone call, I'll do just that.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.